Hi everybody, welcome to class with Professor Mead. Today we're going to talk about deviance. Our think, pair, share for today, I want you to see if you can give a general definition of deviance and then explain deviance from all the different theories: control theory, labeling theory, functionalist, strain, conflict, and symbolic interaction theory. If you haven't been doing so until now, try to turn over a new leaf and pause this for a second and see if you can answer it before the lecture. So what is deviance? Deviance is essentially any time you break a norm, a value, or a mores, and it generates a negative reaction. From the perspective of like micro level analysis, deviance is not about the act itself, but it's about the reaction to the act. In other words, it's not about what you do that is deviant. It's about how people in your culture, your society, your time and place react to you. So why do we talk about it from this perspective? Norms in general, norms, values, and mores make our social life possible. It makes it so that other people have predictable behavior and that you can establish a social order through that. You know, if you act a certain way, someone else is going to act a certain way. You know, if you stop at a red light, the other person's going to stop at a red light, which means that you know you can go when it's a green light without even looking. Sometimes we don't even pay any attention to that, right? Because we just assume that people are going to follow that norm and that value. So how do we do this? We do this through both positive and negative sanctions. In terms of, running a red light, we don't run red lights because we don't want to get a ticket. But the worst negative sanction would be that if we ran a red light and got in a car accident, that has detrimental effects to our lives, right? A positive sanction, for example, is when you're doing something that your parents like or your friends like. They give you props, they smile, they give you encouragement. Those are all kind of positive sanctions, right? And so what it does is it helps us to become conforming members of society. We are almost always conforming members of society. We tend to like to think of ourselves as unique and as individuals, which is kind of true. You're very unique and you are an individual just like everybody else. But you are probably a conforming member of society in most ways, right? When was the last time you went outside the house with no pants on? Probably never, or since pre-understanding that that's breaking a norm, right? So since you were a toddler, you would not leave the house without putting clothes on. That's because there would be both positive and negative sanctions. One of the best negative sanctions in our society, in almost any society, is embarrassment. Most of us never want to be embarrassed, and therefore we will conform to the norms and mores and values of our given society and culture. So let's talk a little bit about all the different types of theories of deviance. There's quite a few. The first one we're going to talk about is control theory. Control theory is a fairly simple theory. I'll explain it and then give you an example. So essentially it says there's two mechanisms that get you to conform. There's inner controls and outer controls, right? So if we have a motivation to deviate, our inner controls, like our morals and our values and our religious belief, might hold us back from doing that behavior. Our outer controls are, we don't want to get in trouble with the law. We don't want to lose our job. We don't want our family to be upset with us. Those are all the outer controls. I'll give you an example of this. So quite a few years ago, I was with my son and we were at Costco, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was there giving a speech for some reason. I have no idea why he would be at Costco, but I just wanted to buy my groceries and go home. But lo and behold, it was absolutely packed. There was no parking, nothing. So we get our groceries, which there were a lot of, and I find my car and I'm about to park. We're getting all our groceries in. I was with my son. He was about 11 at the time. And a gentleman and his wife are waiting for me to get done. And it took us a little bit of time because we had bought so many groceries. And when I finished, I went to put the cart back and he lost his temper and he called me an effing whore. And I lost my temper and I actually raised my hand, something that's not like me to do. And then I stopped. So, if I was in class, I would ask everybody, do you think it was an inner control that stopped me? Or do you think it was an outer control that stopped me? Well, I can tell you it wasn't my conscience. I would not probably have felt all that bad about actually hitting him. And I wouldn't have felt all that upset about getting in trouble legally for hitting him. I was quite distressed at what he had called me, and especially because he had done it in front of my son. What stopped me was I wouldn't want my husband to be upset with me, and he would have been upset with me if I would have gotten in legal trouble while I had my son with me. And so it was, as a matter of fact, an outer control that prevented my behavior to deviate. I hope you like the example because it's kind of a personal one. Okay, let's talk about labeling theory. So labeling theory is a pretty straightforward theory, and it's also a theory for some reason that students tend to gravitate towards. I don't know if it's because they understand it or they like it or what it is, but something that about this theory, people really attach themselves to. Basically what it says is that a person will either embrace or reject a label that you give them. So labels are really an important component of our self-identification and a really good predictor of how we behave in the future. So when you call someone crazy or stupid, or you call a little kid, you tell them, oh, you're a bad boy or you're a good girl, the younger you are, the more likely you are to embrace that label, which means you're going to internalize that label. And the older you are, the more likely you are to reject that label, which allows you to neutralize it, so it's less of a predictor of future behavior. So a good example of this is some research that was done with school-age children, junior high, high school. And what had happened was they studied these kids. They had done kind of typical bad things, gotten in fights in school, and petty theft and that kind of stuff. If they were sanctioned through the school, then that behavior wasn't a very good indicator of future behavior. But if the police were called and they were put through the court systems, their likelihood of reoffending, of continuing to act out in an illegal manner, skyrocketed. So what happens, they believe, is that the label of being a criminal, of being criminalized for their behavior, caused really young people to internalize that label and embrace it, and therefore they were more likely to engage in that behavior in the future. This is one of the reasons why you might see in schools now that they don't do that kind of official punishment. They, will bring a kid in and talk to them and then let them go again, is because that's part of this idea that they don't want to label them. Whether or not it's being done in a way that's effective is, another discussion. Okay, so functionalist theory. This is one of our three main theories in sociology, right? Functionalism, structural functionalism, symbolic interaction, and social conflict. Structural functionalism is macro, symbolic interaction theory is micro, and social conflict theory is also macro. So from a functionalist perspective, members of society learn to internalize the kind of goals and values of that society and the way in which they're supposed to achieve those goals. And so people learn to essentially conform or deviate based on their access or lack of access to resources. And deviance and even crime itself can become functional for society because of the way in which we do positive and negative sanctions. So you're probably going, how can it be possible for crime, like getting mugged, to be functional for society? We're not saying it's functional for the individual, remember, micro level. We're saying it's functional for society, macro level, because this functionalism is a macro level theory. So what the theory asserts is that it's functional for society because it clarifies moral boundaries, it promotes social unity, solidarity, and it promotes social change. It gets us to kind of continue to conform. So let me give you an example of this. A man mugs a lady. He gets caught, she gets hurt, he gets caught. Everybody kind of turns against him and condemns him for his behavior. They give her comfort. He goes to jail, and we all agree that that was a bad thing that he did. We all came together and had a sense of solidarity. We promoted social unity, right? And we created change in that we're saying you can't continue that behavior. We as a society want to move in the other direction. We put a line down, right? A boundary. So it establishes and reestablishes that boundary. It brings people together to condemn the person who was deviant, and it can promote positive social change for people in society. Negative too. In the same way, if you don't, I'll talk to you about it later. Okay. Strain theory. Strain theory essentially says that there's a form of anomie that occurs. Now, strain theory is a functionalist theory, so we're using a functionalist term here. Anomie occurs when people internalize society's traditional goals, like be successful, make a lot of money, buy a house, but they lack the access to legitimate means to do so. They can't get a job, or they can't get a good job, a living wage job, right? So if that happens, it's what we call strain. And so strain makes you more likely to be deviant. Most of us are conformists. Conformity is the most common thing. You're a conformist, I can tell, because you're actually in class. You are actually trying to get a college degree. That makes you just that alone, right? You're conforming to society's expectations. Strain that results in deviance results in some of the other types. You can innovate, ritualize, retreat, or rebel against society. We'll talk about that later in its own theory PowerPoint. Conflict theory on deviance comes from conflict theory, right? So it's the perspective that deviance arises from the antagonism that happens between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. In other words, because the interests of the haves and the have-nots are in direct conflict with each other, those in power, in this case the bourgeoisie, get to define what is deviant and therefore get to punish those who are deviant in a way that they deem appropriate. So that would be why Bernie Madoff, who embezzled, stole millions and millions of dollars, got a slap on the wrist, but a young man who steals a car can end up going to jail for 20 years. It's not because stealing a car is, much more of a crime, or it's much worse than what, embezzling, hundreds of people's retirement and life savings. It's because the type of behavior or deviance that Bernie Madoff did was white-collar crime, which is typically the type of crime that people who are bourgeoisie, that have access to money, financial resources, tend to do. And so they're not going to create laws that would severely punish them if they got caught. But they can't have the proletariat trying to take from the bourgeoisie. So you need to punish the proletariat, the working class, and the poor harshly for deviating and not abiding by the rules, because you need to maintain the status quo. And the status quo, according to conflict theory, is that there are the haves and the have-nots. There are those who own the wealth and those who don't. Okay, next one. symbolic interaction theory. This is our other micro level theory, or only one, right? We react. This one says that deviance is a reaction to an act, right? So we react according to how we interpret a situation. We assign meanings to objects, to events, to everyday interactions. And then we decide whether something is deviant or not based on the assigned meaning that we gave to it. So from a symbolic interaction perspective, we react according to how we interpret the situation. We would be horrified if we saw somebody get killed on the streets. But if we knew that that happened because somebody was being executed under the court of law, then we wouldn't have the same sense of horror, because we've interpreted the meanings and the symbols and the situational context very differently in those two circumstances. Every time we interact with somebody, we create meaning, and then we interpret that meaning, and we do that through our own cultural lens. So from this perspective, deviance is more about our reaction, our interpretation, than it is about the act itself. That's why we would say, right, that a symbolic interactionist would say it's not the act, but the reaction to the act that makes something deviant. A behavior, a trait, a belief, anything that violates the social norm and that gains a negative reaction is going to be deviant from this perspective. Because of that, it's going to vary over time. It'll change. Remember that symbolic interaction is every single interaction changes the meaning of that norm or that value. And it's also going to change from culture to culture. In our culture, in European culture, lines are really important, right? You get in line, you get in the back of the line, you don't cut, you don't push and shove, that kind of thing. But in some cultures, it's normal. The person who's the tallest and has the longest arms and is the pushiest gets their movie ticket first. It's not about standing in line. It's about, you know, just getting what you want, right? So they don't consider that. In some cultures, that's not considered deviant behavior or what we would call rude behavior. And therefore, it doesn't solicit a negative reaction. Okay, so here's your discussion of questions again. Check back your answers, see which ones you knew, and then fill in what you didn't know or that you had incorrect. So you've learned a lot today. We've learned about deviance from control, labeling, functionalist, strain, conflict, and symbolic interaction perspective. Would you be able to, if I asked, to give a picture example or a personal example of all of these? You'll notice this is what I would have had students do as homework, and you also have it as an activity. And then here is your personal review. This is for all of them, and there will be 2 more videos for this week in terms of specifically Merton's typology, which is strain theory, and then all the different theories. This is your, I'm so tired today. This is your reluctant YouTube professor signing off.